I never thought I'd need anyone. Not after everything I've been through. But when danger knocked at my door, Max was there. He's not just a dog. He's my protector, my partner, and my reason to fight. Now, with threats closing in, I'm learning that strength comes in unexpected forms. And I'll do anything to keep the ones I love safe. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The mornings in Fairview were always the same. The air was crisp, the streets were quiet, and the world moved at a pace that made time feel like it was standing still. For some, this town was a slice of heaven, a place where nothing ever happened. For me, it was a reminder of how much I'd lost. I'd lived in this house for over 40 years. When my husband, Henry, and I first moved in, it was bustling with laughter, shared dreams, and the kind of chaos that makes a home feel alive. But when Henry passed, the house changed. The walls seemed colder, the silence louder. I often wondered if it was me or the house that had changed, or maybe it was both. That morning started like every other. I wrapped myself in my old wool coat, grabbed my scarf, and stepped out for my walk. I liked to think the fresh air would do me good, even if it was just to escape the suffocating stillness inside. The streets were damp from last night's rain, and a soft fog lingered in the air. That's when I saw him. By the trash cans at the corner of Maple and Birch, a dog lay curled up, shivering so hard I could see his thin frame tremble. He was a German Shepherd, but not the proud, majestic kind you'd see on television. His fur was matted with mud, his ribs were showing, and his eyes— oh, those eyes. They weren't just desperate, they were pleading. I stopped in my tracks. A part of me said to keep walking. I wasn't equipped to take care of myself some days, let alone a dog in this condition. But as I turned away, I heard it, a soft, heart-wrenching whimper. It wasn't loud, but it pierced through me. "Don't do it, Margaret," I whispered to myself. "You don't need this." But my feet betrayed me, and I found myself moving closer. He didn't bark or growl. He just looked at me, his eyes following my every move. I knelt a few feet away, unsure of what to say. "Hey there, boy," I murmured. My voice felt strange, as if I hadn't spoken out loud in ages. "You don't look too good." His ears perked slightly, but he didn't move. Slowly, I reached out my hand. "Come on. I'm not going to hurt you." To my surprise, he pushed himself up on shaky legs and limped toward me. His trust broke something inside me, something I didn't even know was still there. "I guess you're coming with me," I said, more to myself than to him. I wrapped my scarf around him as best I could, hoping it would help him warm up, and we started the slow walk home. He stayed close, his head low but his step steady. As we approached my house, I looked down at him. "This is a bad idea," I said, shaking my head. But when he glanced up at me with those big, trusting eyes, I knew I couldn't turn back. "I guess we'll figure it out together," I muttered, opening the door to a new chapter in my life, one I never saw coming. Max settled into my home like he'd been there forever, and I found myself talking to him as if he could understand every word. "This is your bed," I told him, setting down an old blanket near the fireplace. He sniffed at it cautiously before curling up and sighing deeply. It was the first time I'd heard him relax, and for reasons I couldn't explain, it made me feel lighter. The first few days were a blur of adjustments. Max followed me everywhere, his nails clicking on the hardwood floor. He watched me with those intense eyes, as if he were waiting for something. He wasn't demanding, just present. And for someone who'd spent years alone, that presence felt like a gift. I learned quickly that Max wasn't like other dogs. On our second day together, I accidentally knocked over a tin of sugar while making tea. Before I could even bend down to clean it up, Max was there, scooping up the tin with his mouth and setting it on the counter with precision. I stared at him, stunned. "What kind of dog are you?" I asked. It wasn't just that. He seemed to understand me in ways I couldn't explain. When I told him to stay, he froze like a statue. If I called his name, he appeared instantly, even if I hadn't trained him. It was uncanny, but I didn't question it. Not yet. One evening, The rain started falling in thick sheets. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and I felt the familiar knot of unease tighten in my chest. Storms always brought out the worst of my memories. Nights spent waiting for Henry to come home, fearing the worst, or those long hours in the hospital when we knew the end was near. I sat in my armchair, staring at the rain streaking the windows. Max was lying on the rug near the fireplace, but as soon as the thunder cracked, he stood and walked over to me. Without hesitation, he rested his head on my lap. I hadn't realized I was crying until I felt his warmth against me. "You're a good boy," I whispered, stroking his head. "Better than I deserve." His tail thumped softly against the floor, and for the first time in years, I felt safe. As the days passed, Max became my shadow. Every morning, we walked through the neighborhood together. He stayed close, his posture alert, as if he were guarding me. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the distant laughter of children, the smell of fresh-cut grass. It was as if Max was teaching me to see the world again. But there were moments that puzzled me. Max had a habit of standing by the window at night, his ears twitching at the slightest sound. One evening, I caught him staring into the darkness, his posture tense. "What are you looking for out there?" I asked. He didn't respond, of course, but his vigilance unsettled me. Then there was the incident with the car. It was parked across the street, its engine idling for longer than seemed normal. Max noticed it too. He stood by the window, his body rigid, a low growl rumbling in his throat. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Despite my unease, Max's presence gave me a sense of comfort I hadn't felt in years. He didn't just fill the silence, he filled the empty spaces in my heart, the ones I thought would stay hollow forever. I didn't know who he was or where he came from, but one thing was certain. Max had become my family. The house was quiet that night. Too quiet. I had just settled into my armchair with a book, Max lying at my feet, when a strange feeling crept over me. It wasn't the wind outside or the hum of the refrigerator. It was a stillness that felt unnatural. Max must have sensed it too. One moment, he was dozing, his ears flicking lazily at the occasional creak of the house. The next, he was on his feet, his body tense, his ears alert. He moved to the window, his head low, and let out a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down my spine. "Moksh," I whispered, setting my book aside. He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on something outside. I followed his gaze, but saw nothing. "It's probably just a raccoon," I said, more to myself than to him. But he didn't relax. Then I heard it, the faint sound of glass cracking. My heart stopped. I sat frozen in my chair, gripping the arms as if they could hold me steady. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable creak of the back door. Someone was inside my house. I reached for the phone, my hands trembling so badly I could barely dial. But before I could press the final number, Max moved. He bolted toward the hallway with a speed I didn't think possible. His growl deepened into a bark so fierce it echoed through the house. "Moksh," I called out, my voice shaking. But he was gone, disappearing into the darkness. The next moments were a blur of chaos. I heard footsteps, heavy, panicked, followed by a man's startled cry. "What the? Get this dog off me," another voice shouted. Max barked again, the sound sharp and commanding, like a warning. I crept toward the hallway, my legs feeling like jelly. From the shadows, I saw them. Two men, both wearing masks, their hands clutching at whatever they could grab. Max had one of them pinned against the wall, his teeth bared, his growls vibrating through the air. "Let's get out of here," the other man yelled, dropping a bag that clattered loudly to the floor. He lunged toward Max with a metal tool, but Max was faster. He dodged the swing and turned his focus on the second intruder, forcing him to retreat toward the door. "Run!" the first man screamed, scrambling to his feet. They didn't need to be told twice. Within seconds, they were gone, leaving behind a trail of scattered belongings and broken glass. I sank to the floor, my hands trembling as I pulled Max into a hug. His body was still tense, his ears twitching as if he was waiting for them to return. "You saved me," I whispered, burying my face in his fur. "You really saved me." He let out a soft whine, his tail wagging gently. It was the first sign that he was still the Max I knew, the gentle, loyal companion who had become my family. But as I sat there in the wreckage of my living room, a chilling thought crept into my mind. Who were those men? And why had they targeted me? More importantly, how had Max known exactly what to do? The questions swirled in my mind as I called the police, but one thing was clear. Max wasn't just any dog. He was something extraordinary. And for the first time, I realized that whatever his story was, it wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The police arrived shortly after I called, their lights flashing in the quiet street like something out of a nightmare. The scene in the house was chaotic: broken glass, overturned furniture, and the remnants of the intruder's hurried escape. I stood by the door, still in shock, as the officers took notes and questioned me, trying to make sense of what had happened. "Are you sure you didn't see anything suspicious before tonight?" one of the officers, a tall man with a gruff voice, asked. I shook my head. I had been so focused on Max, on the strange way he'd reacted, that I hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. "No," I replied, my voice shaky. "It was just a normal evening until... The officer gave me a hard look. "Until the dog started acting strange?" I nodded. "Yes. I've never seen him act that way before." Max was sitting at my feet, his eyes scanning the room, his ears still perked as if waiting for something. The officers seemed to take note of his behavior, but didn't comment. It wasn't until they left, promising to follow up on the investigation, that I felt a strange sense of unease wash over me. Why had Max reacted so strongly? Why had he known something was wrong before I did? After they left, I sat down on the couch, feeling the weight of the night settle around me. Max hopped up beside me, his body curling against mine as if offering comfort. I absent-mindedly scratched his ears, trying to push away the nagging feeling that I was missing something. It was then that I heard it, something I hadn't noticed before. A soft whine, almost like a murmur. Max's head jerked up, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the front door. His ears twitched, and he let out a low growl, deep in his chest. I followed his gaze, but the house was silent. Too silent. The storm outside had died down, leaving an oppressive stillness in its wake. My heart beat faster. Could they be coming back? But when I checked the locks, everything was secure. No one was there. It was only then that I realized the truth. Max wasn't just protecting me from the intruders. He was waiting for something. Or someone. It wasn't until later that night, when the house was completely still, that I began to piece together the details. I was sitting in my study, going through papers when I found it, a small, crumpled envelope hidden behind a stack of old mail. There was no return address, just a single name written on the front. Max. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Who could have left this here? And why was Max's name on it? I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside, there was only one sheet of paper, handwritten in a hurried scrawl. Max is not just any dog. His purpose is to protect you. Don't trust anyone. They know about him, and they'll stop at nothing to get to you. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I read it again, then again, but the message was clear. Max wasn't just a stray dog. He was something or someone who had been sent to me. Sent to protect me. But who was behind this? Who knew about Max, and why had they targeted me? I glanced down at Max, who had followed me into the study. He was watching me with those knowing eyes, his expression calm but alert. He seemed to sense my fear, and for the first time, I felt like I was no longer the one in control. Max was the one with the answers. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that whatever was happening wasn't just about me. It was about something bigger, something far more dangerous than I could ever have imagined. Max had been sent here for a reason. And whatever that reason was, it was going to change everything. The morning after the break-in, I felt like a stranger in my own home. The curtains stayed drawn, the doors double-locked, and every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. Max was always by my side, his eyes sharp and watchful, as if he could sense the invisible tension that had settled over us. It wasn't long before I heard the knock at the door.
Eve froze, clutching Max's collar instinctively.
When I peeked through the peephole, I saw a man standing there, tall and broad-shouldered, with a look that was equal parts serious and kind. He was wearing a leather jacket and holding a leash in one hand. "Margaret Whitmore?" he asked when I cracked the door open. "Yes. I'm Jack Turner," he said. His voice was steady, but had an edge of something I couldn't quite place. Urgency, maybe. "I think you have my dog." My grip on the door tightened. "Your dog?" "Max," he said, and the name sounded different coming from him. Familiar, affectionate. "I trained him. We were partners."
I didn't know what to say.
The idea that Max had a past, a life before me, shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. I opened the door wider, and Max's reaction said everything. His ears perked up, his tail wagged hesitantly, and for the first time since I'd found him, he let out a soft bark, one filled with recognition. Jack knelt down, holding out his hand. "Hey, buddy. I thought I'd lost you." Max approached him slowly, his movements cautious, as if he wasn't sure whether to trust the moment. But then he leaned into Jack, nuzzling his hand, and Jack's face broke into a smile. "Good boy," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I stood there, feeling an odd mixture of relief and dread. Relief because Max had someone who cared for him, and dread because I realized I might lose him. "He's yours?" I asked finally, my voice quieter than I intended. Jack stood, nodding.
He was.
We worked together in the K-9 unit. Max was trained for everything, search and rescue, protection, you name it. But about a year ago, during an operation, there was an explosion. He went missing. We all thought. He trailed off, but I understood. They thought he hadn't survived. "How did he end up here?" I asked, looking at Max, who was now sitting between us, his head cocked as if he was listening to every word. "I don't know," Jack admitted. "But he found you for a reason." His eyes softened. "Dogs like Max, they're not just pets. They're protectors. If he stayed with you, it's because he thought you needed him." The weight of his words settled over me. Max hadn't just wandered into my life.
He had chosen me.
Jack spent the rest of the day helping me secure the house. He reinforced the locks, adjusted the broken windows, and even installed a few makeshift alarms, simple wires attached to bells that would jingle if the doors or windows were tampered with. "It's not perfect," he said, "but it'll buy you time." We worked side by side, and in the moments of quiet, Jack shared stories about Max. He told me about the time Max had found a missing child in the woods, how he had once disarmed a suspect with nothing but his presence, and how he had a knack for knowing when someone needed help. "Sounds familiar," I said, glancing at Max, who was lying in the doorway, his eyes half closed but his ears still twitching. Jack smiled. "Yeah, he's one of a kind." As the sun began to set, Jack grew serious. "Margaret," he said, "I don't think those men are finished. They know about Max now, and that makes him and you a target." The thought sent a shiver down my spine. "What do we do?" I asked. "We prepare," he said simply. "And we trust Max." That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The house felt different now, not just because of the new locks or the makeshift alarms, but because of the realization that my life had changed. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a guardian, a protector. And the danger wasn't over. As I stared at the ceiling, Max jumped up onto the bed, curling up beside me. He rested his head on my chest, and for the first time since the break-in, I felt a flicker of hope. Whatever was coming, we would face it together. The night was still, too still. Even the usual sounds of Fairview, the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of traffic, seemed to have vanished. It was as if the world was holding its breath. Max lay by the front door, his ears twitching at every creak, while Jack sat at the kitchen table, his gun holstered but within easy reach. I paced the living room, my nerves on edge. "They're coming, aren't they?" I asked Jack, though I already knew the answer. He nodded, his expression calm but focused. "They'll try again. And this time, They'll be ready for Max. The weight of his words settled heavily in the room. Max, my protector, my hero, was in danger because of me. But as I looked at him, calm, alert, ready, I realized he wasn't afraid. And if he wasn't, then neither could I be. The hours dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Just as I began to think we were imagining things, Max's head shot up. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, and he moved to the window, his body tense. "They're here," Jack said, standing up and grabbing his gun. He moved toward the back door, motioning for me to stay put. "Lock yourself in the bedroom, Margaret." I wanted to argue, to say that I wasn't going to hide while my home was under attack, but Max's growl grew louder, and I knew this wasn't the time to be brave. I nodded and hurried to the bedroom, leaving the door slightly ajar so I could see what was happening. The first sound was faint, a soft clink as one of Jack's makeshift alarms was triggered. Max bolted toward the back of the house, his growls growing into sharp barks that echoed through the halls. I peeked out just in time to see the shadow of a man slipping through the window. Jack moved like lightning, his gun drawn but steady. "Freeze!" he barked, his voice cold and commanding. The intruder hesitated, but before Jack could do anything, another figure emerged from the shadows, lunging toward him. And then Max was there. He leapt at the second man with a ferocity I'd never seen, his teeth sinking into the intruder's arm and pulling him to the ground. The man screamed, thrashing wildly, but Max didn't let go. Jack turned his attention back to the first man, who was already retreating toward the window. "Don't even think about it," Jack said, stepping forward with his gun aimed. The man froze, his hands raised. The chaos seemed to escalate all at once. From the front of the house, I heard the sound of glass shattering, followed by heavy footsteps. "There's more of them," I whispered to myself, my heart pounding. Before I could think, Max started past me, heading toward the living room where the new intruders were entering. Jack followed, his movements quick and precise. I stood frozen, my fear warring with the urge to help. The next moments were a blur of noise and motion. Max took down another man, his growls filling the air as he pinned him to the ground. Jack fired a warning shot into the ceiling, forcing the remaining intruders to freeze in place. "Get out," Jack commanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Or the next one won't be a warning." The men hesitated, glancing at each other, but it was clear they knew they were outmatched. One by one, they retreated, disappearing into the night. Max stayed alert, his body tense, until the last shadow was gone. When it was over, the house was silent again, except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. Jack lowered his gun, his shoulders relaxing slightly, and Max trotted over to me, his tail wagging as if to say, "We did it." I sank to the floor, pulling Max into my arms. "You're incredible," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "You saved us." Jack crouched beside me, his hand on Max's head. "He's not just a dog, Margaret. He's a partner. And he's damn good at his job." The sound of police sirens in the distance broke the quiet. As they arrived and took statements, I felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. The danger was over, at least for now.
But the night had changed me.
I wasn't just a helpless old woman anymore. I was someone who had fought for her home, her life, and won. Max had shown me what it meant to be brave, to trust, to stand tall even when fear threatened to pull me under. And as I sat there, stroking his fur, I realized something else. He hadn't just saved me. He'd given me a reason to keep going. The sun was rising as I sat in the living room, the stillness of the house almost surreal after the chaos of the night. Max was beside me, his head resting on my lap as if nothing had happened, his steady breathing calming my own erratic heart. I stroked his fur, trying to make sense of everything. Jack had stayed behind after the police had finished taking their statements. He didn't need to, but he did. He had this way of making sure everything was in place, that no detail was overlooked. Max had his own way of doing things, too, silent, steady, unshakable. I glanced at the clock. It had been almost 12 hours since the break-in. 12 hours of fear, of running from shadows, and of discovering the bond one had with Max was far deeper than I had ever imagined. Jack had left just an hour ago to make a statement of his own. He'd told me to rest, to take some time for myself. But how could I? There was so much to process, so much to understand. I had never thought of myself as someone who needed protecting. I had spent my entire life keeping my distance, ensuring no one could hurt me. But now I understood sometimes we need help. Sometimes we need to lean on others, whether they're human or not. Max had given me that strength. I stood up, moving to the window, my hands pressed against the cool glass. The street outside was quiet, the sun casting a warm glow on the neighborhood, as if nothing had ever happened. But everything had changed. I thought about the men who had come to my home, the men who had tried to take what wasn't theirs. Jack had been right. They weren't finished. They would keep coming for Max, and for me, until we stopped them. My fingers tightened against the window pane, and for a moment, I thought about leaving, about finding somewhere far away where I could disappear, where Max could be safe, where we could live without fear. But that wasn't the answer. Running never was. Max wasn't just a dog. He was my protector, my partner. And I would protect him no matter what. A knock at the door startled me from my thoughts. My heart skipped a beat as I turned toward the sound. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but when I opened the door and saw Jack standing there, his eyes steady but not without concern, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. He gave me a quick nod. "We're good. The police have everything they need. The men who broke in, don't worry about them. We're already tracking their movement. It's just a matter of time before they're caught." I stepped aside to let him in, my mind racing. What happens now? Jack glanced at Max, who was sitting by the door, watching us intently. "We keep moving forward. You and Max. You stay strong. We've got this." I nodded, though the uncertainty still lingered in the back of my mind. I wasn't naive. I knew the danger wasn't over. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I wasn't alone. As the day passed, we made plans. Jack would help me fortify the house even more. Max would stay by my side, ready for whatever came next. And as we talked, I realized something else. I wasn't just afraid anymore. I wasn't just fighting for my safety. I was fighting for my life, for the person I was becoming. Someone who would never run again. By the time the evening rolled around, I stood on my porch, gazing at the horizon. Max was beside me, his presence a constant, unwavering reassurance. The street was quiet, but I knew the storm wasn't over. But whatever came next, we would face it together. And that made all the difference.